So one of the things that you're often going to want to do with Adobe Illustrator is integrate photos, photography, or maybe illustrations or what have you. Stuff that's been taken with a camera or drawn and scanned, like paintings or whatever. So those types of photos, typically they're in JPEG format, or sometimes they're in .psd format or .png format. These are all raster graphic formats. That means basically pictures that are made up of little dots or pixels that we can then put on the internet or use in print or whatever. But they're different from vector files in that they're not scalable infinitely. They can be scaled up or down a little bit, but the bigger they get, the kind of more pixelated or kind of blurry they start to look. And if you scale them down, they sort of can start to disappear into a bunch of little dots. So this is where you might have heard of pixels per inch or dots per inch. So pixels per inch and dot per inch don't really apply to vector graphics because they're scalable. All we really care about is their ratio, but they can fit within any size. But raster graphics are different. Photos are different. But we can work with photos in Adobe Illustrator. So a pretty typical thing, I'm just going to bring up my Windows Explorer here. I've saved a couple of stock photos. This is going to be a really typical situation. Say you're laying out a graphic or whatever, and you want to work with these pictures in your newsletter, just kind of a random selection of some photos here. Okay, so in Windows, you might have an image that you want to use as part of a background or whatever. So you're doing a newsletter layout and you want to make some headers to fit at the top of your Google Doc file. But you don't want to just be limited to what you can do in Google Docs, which is basically just crop the image. You want to put some type over it, maybe put a gradient over it, put a logo in it, all these things. This is what Adobe Illustrator is really quite handy at. And there's quite a few different ways that you can work with Illustrator to build graphics as part of a layout. So I'm going to go through that. So this is going to be a slightly longer tutorial, but if you want to kind of work with this, you're going to want to get yourself a couple of JPEG files. You get them from a stock photo service or whatever. Okay, so when we talk about pixels per inch, I'm going to go and I'm going to right click and I'm going to show properties. Okay, so when we go into the properties, we can see that under the details tab, this image is 3,264 pixels by 2,448 pixels. The resolution for this file is set to 300 dpi. So to figure out, and so what that is, 300 dpi is dots per inch. That's kind of our optimum image resolution for print. You know, most high quality magazines, whatever, they're going to be somewhere, they're going to be printed at somewhere between 200 and 300 dots per inch. And obviously an inch on a piece of paper is an inch on a piece of paper. So the more dots you get, the more detailed your image is going to be, up to about 300 dpi after that. Can't really make out the details because paper's not fine enough. You know, your average phone, you know, like an iPhone or a modern phone, screen's actually going to be quite a bit more higher resolution than that. You're going to see like 400, maybe even 500 pixels in a physical inch of screen space. Whereas your laptop computer or your desktop computer might be somewhat quite a bit less, somewhere down about maybe 150 pixels per inch. Depends again completely on the screen size and the image resolution, but that's in a nutshell, that's what pixels per inch are. You can of course change this. You could say it's 100 dpi. It's not going to change the number of pixels, it's just going to change the image density and therefore in a way the resolution and the size. But when we're resizing images and stuff like that in Illustrator doesn't really super care about that. It's going to export and convert depending on what your output is. But mainly you just want to make sure that you've got enough pixels to fill your required screen space. So this one would be a pretty normal image. That's basically 3 megapixels roughly. A megapixel is 1,000,000 pixels, just in case you want to know. And typically that's 1,000 by 1,000 is 1 megapixel. But if we just drag an image, this image, we can just drag it right into Adobe Illustrator. And you can see that, you know, Illustrator is roughly translating at 300 dpi to just shy of 11 inches. Just happens to be how big that image is. So when we see an X through a thing, and I'm going to bring up my layers palette again. in my layers palette here. This is called a linked file. So it's linked relative to the location on your hard drive. So where I drag and drop that from, if we go to the window links palette, if you're familiar with InDesign, you'll be familiar with this. It's the same thing. Okay. That's where it is on my C drive, right? Relative path. And that's because I saved it right in the same folder path on my hard drive. So if you move this image, or if you upload the Adobe Illustrator file, but not the linked image along with it, this will show up as a missing file. It won't know where to find it because that path won't exist once you upload it and email it or whatever. So often what we're doing is we're embedding a placed image into Adobe Illustrator. And this is kind of a single step process because it's kind of built into a typical thing that we want to do. Pretty rare that we want to work with an image exactly as is. We kind of want to fit it within a box, put some effects over it, do all this kind of thing. So we have the first option when working with an image is we can right click and say crop image. It's going to give you this little crop preview. So maybe I don't want the whole thing in there. I know I'm just going to use this part of it, let's say. I hit enter. So this is no longer, as soon as I crop an image, it's no longer a linked image, it's now just an image or an embedded part of this file. Now I don't need to send this around with it. This is just going to fit. But I've kind of locked it down at its pixels per inch and its dimensions. Now notice if I scale this image here in the info palette, if I scale it down, the pixels per inch changes. It goes up to 444. Similarly, if I make it bigger, it goes down 172 because I've scaled that image relative to the layout pasteboard size, my artboard size. So you can kind of pay attention to that. Helps you manage and make sure your quality of your image stays kind of right. So that's one way to kind of just crop an image within it. But we can also create things called clipping guides or clipping masks. We can make a clipping mask out of any shape that we can make in Adobe Illustrator. So obviously the most basic is a rectangle. Okay, so in the layer structure, I've drawn this rectangle over the image. If I hold down Shift to click there, to select them both at the same time, and then say hit Control 7, that makes what's called a clip group. So you can kind of clip a mask into any shape. So say I have a circle. I can also make a copy of my embedded image. So I can say Control C to copy it. Go back up to this layer, paste to make a copy. Bring my circle over top of it. So you can work with the same image and crop it and what have you. So clip groups are kind of a handy way to work with pictures. And if we want to go in and put a fade or a logo or whatever, we just go and put it inside that clip group, manage it around inside, and we can apply our effects. So a really common thing would be put like a gradient fade over top of it. So let's just do that as a quick demo. Okay. So we're going to remember how we built gradients before. We're going to bring up our gradient palette. You should remember your grouping before. I'm going to bring up our swatches palette. Okay. So in this case, I want to do a white fade. I want to fade white over top of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just grab my white color, drag it into the default gradient. So it's got my first stop there. Delete the black. This opacity is 100. I'm going to set this one to 0. I'm going to save that. So now I've added a white transparent fade gradient to my swatch library. Now I'm going to double click in to my clipping group. So let's get our layers back up so you can see what's going on here. And in this rectangle, this rectangle makes the clipping shape. I'm going to put another rectangle over top of that within the clip group. Just get the this out of the way here. I'm going to put my swatches back into my palette dock the way I like it. And my layers. So I'm going to draw another rectangle right over top of this image. Make sure I don't have my previous rectangle selected. You can see that that white gradient is applied just because I had it set there. But if that doesn't happen for you, go back to your swatches palette and select that gradient swatch. Then I can use the gradient shaper tool to adjust how it goes, whatever. And now you can see that clip group has a fade over top of it that you can kind of move around in your layout and whatever. So this is where you can kind of mock up your layouts. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk through the next step, sort of working with Illustrator as sort of a tool for exporting pieces. So as I was saying, there's an export function in Adobe Illustrator where you can, now that you've finished this particular version of the graphic, you can either go File, Export, Export for Screens, okay? So what this does is it takes whatever is on each of your artboards and exports the whole artboard as one graphic. And you can name it what you like or whatever. And then you can change your format, PNG, set scaling, or specific resolution or what have you. But you can use Illustrator to create entire graphics based on your artboard. But that's not always useful. Sometimes you want to use Adobe Illustrator to mock up a layout, but then you just want to export parts of it for use in your other graphics. So that's where you've got this other option, which is you can right click on any clip group or object that you have, and you can say Export Selection. So in this case, it's just that one selection, but then I can just name this, Three Sisters with Fade. I'm going to keep this as a 1x, so that means literally at the size, at the dots per inch or at the pixel dimension that Illustrator has this set up, export at 2 pixels at the PNG format. And I choose where I want to target that, so let's just make our folder in Learning Illustrator called Exports. And then we're going to export that asset. So we'll typically, if you got it set that way, it's just going to open it. So this file now is a JPEG that's just been exported out of your layout as a standalone piece that now you can upload to your application of choice, and it'll fit right in there because you've worked out your sizing and your relative space. So Illustrator is pretty handy for that. It will resample and rescale those images for you. So if I go to my properties now and go to details, you can now see that this is much smaller, 722 by 256 pixels, right? Because that's the setting in my main Adobe Illustrator file. So that's typically what we want to see because that makes the file a lot smaller. It's already pre-cropped to the setting that we need for our application. But again, you got to know what you're exporting to. But for the most part, it's just inches, and the dots per inch is kind of down around 72 or whatever for something like Google Docs or PowerPoint or what have you. I think PowerPoint's 100 pixels per inch. But that's just understanding your target dimension. So as well, if you're familiar with like headers for Twitter or Instagram postings or whatever, those dimensions are always published in pixels, and you can target those precisely out of Adobe Illustrator and use it as an exporting tool for individual pieces without having to go through and make a separate artboard for every single size. So there's exporting of artboards, which is the entire, whatever's on the artboard will get made into a graphic, or there's the export selection tool. So this can be very handy for putting type or whatever, but also just being aware that you can make a clipping mask out of any shape. And it kind of crosses over to what might be a whole other video, but just as a very basic, this is kind of where type is used in Adobe Illustrator. So let's say, headline, all caps, and we want to put that in a really big, bold font. So let's go to our window and bring up our type submenu called character, where we can change our fonts. So let's use something really bold like Archivo or something. I mean, we've got millions of fonts installed. We can get into fonts later, but let's just use this one. You know, so that's pretty big. But let's say I wanted to, let's actually do something a little more on topic. Okay, so say we wanted to put the mountains in behind that type, like fill it in like that. So there's a couple different things we can do. We can even use type as a mask, which is kind of cool. So double click into your clip group. Let's copy this. Scale it up. So Control-7, that makes your active type into a mask. You want to kind of change where that relative image is. Say once you've got it in there, you kind of want to play around with it. Go into your layers, open the clip group, select the image, and then you can use the arrow keys to move that up and down until that graphic is kind of placed there. So basically any shape that you can make in Adobe Illustrator you can use as a clipping mask over an image, and then you can export that as a PNG, and all the transparency in the background will work on a web page or whatever. So this can be a pretty useful thing with Adobe Illustrator. Is just kind of a quick graphic production tool for other tool sets. This will then also, of course, work in print or any other place that you want to link to this Adobe Illustrator file. So it's kind of a couple of different things that you might want to try out there. Just placing an image, cropping it so that it's embedded in your file, and then try making a couple of different shapes, making clip groups, try putting it in behind type like this, and then use the export selection tool. In this case, you know, CBAMF text, PNG, export that. Now you can see you've got this PNG. I'm going to just show you how a PNG works like directly in a web browser. So you can bring up any web browser and you can just drag a PNG right into it. You can kind of see how that's working. It's rendering the background as gray because that's just the default. But if you bring it into something like a Google Doc, you can use this as part of your layout. Let's just do that. Okay, so I can literally drag images right into my Google Doc layout. And because of the sizing here, you can see directly how that works with my grid measurement here. It's not really a guessing game as to how it's going to fit. The nice thing too is you can scale up or down. You know, these images will look pretty good as they scale down. They're just going to have a limit as to how big they can go. See how it goes kind of fuzzy and pixelated? That's because that's a raster graphic. So there's a limit as to how big raster graphics can go and still look sharp and crisp. So you kind of want to target 100% of your placement size or less because they're going to look good. Try and zoom them up, they're going to get kind of fuzzy. But that's a really common way to work with graphics from Adobe Illustrator and then integrate them into something like a Google Doc, which is then going to be really flexible. I guess the last thing here is just like something like a PNG format. Okay. So say you make yourself a table. Let's see, where do we do that? Here. So let's make ourselves a 1x2 table. We're going to say fill the background with a color, whatever that color might be. Then you might want to put your image in there. But because it's a PNG graphic that we exported to, it's got what's called an alpha channel. So anything in Adobe Illustrator that we haven't filled, that we've just left empty, is going to be used as a transparent space. So you can use that to work with your document layout or your web page or whatever, and have whatever background color you put in place show through. which is pretty handy if you're doing newsletter layouts, quarterly reports. So a lot of times that layout work's going to be done in Google Docs or Microsoft Word or whatever. These graphics are all going to work quite well from Adobe Illustrator. So hopefully that is a pretty helpful thing for you to sort of see a little bit more practically. You know, everything we've been doing in Adobe Illustrator up to this point is just sort of exercise, theoretical stuff. But now this is starting to get more into real practical ways that you can do it. So you can really see how you can kind of pre-visualize your layouts, any graphic elements. You can kind of put in a text block or whatever, but then once you're ready and happy with it, you can go through and export your selections, add them into your Google Doc, and you're off to the races when it comes to building a layout.